So Greta Olson, as many of you know, is a professor of English and American and cultural studies at the University of Giessen in Germany. She is, among many other things, the general editor of the European Journal of English Studies. I've been in touch with Greta in that capacity, I remember, from 7-8 years ago. And with her colleague, Jean Gaker, she's the co-founder of the European Network for Law and Literature. In that area, she's written a monograph, From Law and Literature to Legality and Affect, that I just checked will be published by Oxford University Press at the beginning of June, or so they promise. Her talk today will build on that, will also build, I'm sure, on a co-edited 2018 book entitled Beyond Gender, Futures of Feminist and Sexuality Studies, which was published with Routledge. Part of that future is what her title today promises to move towards, which is, and I quote, decolonial trans feminist woman. Greta, thanks for being with us. I look forward to listening to you, and the screen is totally yours.
Thank you, Peter. I think I've been reading and corresponding with you for years, but this is the first time I'm seeing you, if only as a flat surface. Thank you, Nidish, for bringing us together. And I need to thank my dear colleague, Sarah Pollock, who agreed to come to my home in Germany so that we could have some of the conviviality of drinking together in the evening, talking and sharing ideas. And I couldn't hear so much, but I've already been enlivened by the talks I've heard, also Julia's just now, that I'll come back to. What I'm doing here in this, and I'm going to frame it a little bit, is two recent publications. One with a PhD student of mine who's really breaking new ways. She's doing queer readings of law, and we compare anti-trans legislation in Germany and in the United States. I work in both of those areas, and in both German and English. And another piece that I've written with a younger feminist, Ellie Lechner, who I can only recommend to you. She's in Austria, also very present online, on controversies in feminisms and why we have to talk about them as a productive way to move forward. So I'm working on thoughts that have come out of those dialogues with those two wonderful younger colleagues, and I'm working my way forward. The question I want to ask is, and this is inspired also by Braidotti, Irigaray, Wittig, Butler, and any number of queer feminist lesbian scholars. Is our feminism still tenable given womens as a concept and feminisms? And there are multiple feminisms, but feminism is treated as a singular, inscription and overdetermination as white and colonial. Since the beginning of feminisms, or even proto-feminisms, but since feminisms got a name roughly about the time of the French Revolution, there's been a discussion of who is excluded from the concept of who feminisms work or fight for and advocate for. We see this in Sojourner Truth, 1848, a Black woman, a former slave during the time when slavery was still in place in the United States, saying, "Ain't I a woman?" She's born 7, 8 children, but she also has plowed fields, and no one helps her into a carriage. Of don't I also exist within that category of women, and recognizing that she does not. And from the beginning within feminisms have been a discussion of who do they not speak for. I believe, like the category of woman, feminisms, or feminism as it's often treated as a singular, has become highly contentious. Also, the way controversies in feminisms are being represented and narrated, in this case narrated, is very often as a catfight between caricatures of different positions. And I believe this serves to disvalue and also to take away the cogency of different feminist and trans and queer positions. So amongst some of the most important books that I've been reading recently are, and you can see from the similarity of their titles, books that are describing the overwhelming whiteness and problematic whiteness of feminism. The first three that you can see on the screen deal with the US-American case. The United States is my country of origin. I've been living in Germany, however, for 30 years. The Trouble with White Women, A Counter-History of Feminism, is a history of the United States and feminisms, in which every chapter in which we know of a well-known white woman figurehead in feminism is countered by an indigenous, Latina, or Black woman whose history we largely have not heard, or have heard an incomplete story of, also Sojourner Truth, whom I just mentioned. White Feminism by Koa Beck talks about the problematic, not only whiteness, but bourgeois quality of most dominant feminisms in the United States. Who gets to speak, who is published, and who is not heard. Against White Feminism, Notes on Disruption, is a very personalized account of dominant US feminisms, both their racisms, both their exclusion of women of color, Black women in the American scene. And as Zakiria writes, this too is a legacy of white supremacy. Feminism is only to be thought in the context of white supremacy. Feminism itself has never been disaggregated from the white gaze. It has become the only kind of feminism we recognize or even have a language for. Moving but staying within the Anglophone realm, Ruby Hamid's 2020 White Tears, Brown Scars, How White Feminism Portrays Women of Color, tunes them both to the critique important recently in critical race studies of white fragility as a form of emotion with whites disown responsibility for racism, and also traces the colonial history of suppression of brown women in Britain and the colonies of Britain. I can strongly recommend all of these books. Schuler writes in her counter history, similarly to what I've just quoted, white feminism is an active form of harm. White feminist objectives work to liberate privileged women while keeping other structures of injustice intact. It can only be reformed by being abolished. In other words, it is not tenable at all. This critique is highly valuable. There may be a few difficulties involved in it, one of which is that it may disregard a history of decolonial, or I'd say post-colonial, decolonial, and Black feminisms in the American context of Sojourner Truth, Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde, Angela Davis, many other important women speakers who describe the whiteness of American feminism. Decolonial feminists like Maria Lugones have said long ago, also Rhoda Reddock, that we have to think about feminism as an outgrowth of a gender system that could only exist in conjunction with slavery and capitalism. And that actually our gender divide and binary is a product of coloniality. And we have to think through that first before we start to work through the gender binary. Post-colonial feminists like Spivak and Mohanty have criticized the creation of a homogenized woman, a veiled woman, a third world woman who is one thing. I see a danger in some of this work, particularly Sicaria's against white feminism, and this is where, like woman, feminism becomes over-determined and over-inscribed, of the feminist as an ugly, unkind, also very bougie, white person, white woman, a white cis woman. And regretfully, this can be as homogenizing as the figure of the third world woman under Western eyes, Mohanty's important book. And servicing misogyny, Sonia Soda describes in describing Sicaria's work, this is exactly what lazy polemics about terrible white feminism do. They empower men to use the fact that all white women are supposedly high up in the privileged pecking order to tell middle-aged women to shut up. In other words, there's also an ageist quality to some of this work and how it's been used. Feminisms right now are in the midst of working through exclusions within feminist positions, and also how I am a passionate feminist, are regarded from outside. And I'm not going to say this for the first time. Very often feminist controversies are troped as catfights to derogate whatever positions are involved. So whereas one wants to feel really happy about Women's March 2017, a direct reaction to Trump's election in 2016, what Sarah talked about this morning, and a pushing back against Trump and his counter-truths. The Women's March moment was hounded from the beginning by exclusions, a discussion of whether it was neo-imperialist, whether it was anti-Semitic, and also anti-trans and anti-non-binary, with those lovely pink hats that resembled cis women's genitalia. This continues to be central to feminist discussions now. So secondly, and I have to first say problematically, impassioned feminist that I am, if feminism is white supremacy, not my name, damn it all. A second point, are feminism still tenable given the exclusion of trans women and feminine identifying non-binary persons by gender critical feminists, called more often in a description that they don't buy themselves, TERFs, trans exclusive radical feminists. This in particular, this division, I don't write it because then I'm reifying it. We're talking about mimesis, inscription, determination, TERF against trans is also posted and formed as a catfight. Besides J.K. Rowling, whom you will all have heard of, let me give you a few other moments. Again, pre-corona, at the 2018 Pride March in London, a group, note not all, but a group of lesbians chose to not march with the rest of Pride. The LGBTQIA communities, saying that they were, as lesbians have so often been in history, being erased by the Rainbow Coalition as a position, and that Pride was male-centered, also white-centered, and erasing lesbian existence. In the movement and website Get the L Out of LGBTQ, there are discussions of women, in this case, cis women's spaces, being erased for economic, political reasons, and queerness, male domination. And here, as we see, painfully for me, this is not a majoritarian position, that a trans activism, and this is a point I can explain more perhaps in the discussion, is erasing lesbian existence and identities. This minority position has been taken up in a widely described media narrative around the person of Kathleen Stock. Kathleen Stock wrote or has had published in 2021 an important book in terms of how it's made a splash, Material Girls and the Reality of Sex Difference. She left her post at a British university saying she'd been hounded out by her former labor union and former colleagues who had encouraged students to call her transphobic, to say that her presence was making them feel unhappy on campus. Number one, Stock has been framed as a speaker of free speech and as the victim of cancel culture, victim of those young hysterical digital people, et cetera, et cetera. I would say this is a middle-aged preoccupation, that making cancel culture a boogaboo. I'm looking at the mid-aged people in the room with me. But a second part is because Kathleen Stock is lesbian, she is often seen as a speaker for the entirety of LGBTQIA communities inappropriately. So in this troping and framing, we have not only TERFs against trans, but free speech versus trans rights. Stock's resignation from the university due to her gender critical views has been instrumentalized to disparage feminists and trans and non-binary persons alike. In an essentialist plotting, and because she's lesbian, Stock is presented as able to speak for lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersexual, and asexual persons. Stock's framing as a speaker for these communities does a disservice to feminisms. So do her many efforts to uphold the restrictive UK Gender Recognition Act, something that I can go into in more detail. So again, catfight, trans against TERFs. And this has become a vehement and very loud discussion in the internet and also elsewhere. I believe it's also a very simplistic troping. It also, and problematically, equates lesbians with TERFs, taking away the radicalness of the lesbian position as a position from which to dismantle the whole gender hierarchy altogether. And it simplifies positions, both counterpositions within trans and non-binary communities and within gender critical schools of thought. Through this, as I see it, and this is historically problematic, we are getting a very flattened image of lesbians, increasingly who are becoming the old white grumpy men of queer communities and how they're being framed. And in a sentiment that I absolutely agree with as a queer feminist, this is something that I saw in London, not in London, sorry, in Berlin, at Women's March on the 8th, just a few weeks ago. Support your sisters, not your sisters, as I would say a majoritarian position, nonetheless, not as it's being framed. Through this flattening, I believe we're ultimately discrediting feminisms. So feminisms have slid into the image of a TERF. So white supremacist, bougie, unaware of the material realities of the non-bourgeois, grumpy, and exclusionist, and eliding the whole radical histories of lesbianisms. Not in my name. Can feminism still be tenable given that naturalized images of cis women, note cis women, are consistently employed in anti-gender rhetoric, and in Europe, particularly as I see it, in Germany with our alternative for Germany, AfD, in Austria, in Hungary, in Poland, also in Russia, but also in Brazil and the United States. Anti-gender rhetoric is a railing against the dangers both of feminism and LGBTQIA plus perspectives. Against this, very often it is argued by conservatives that a naturalized, vulnerable woman or girl, the best is if she's a blonde girl, this is a racist rhetoric, is threatened by feminism and LGBTQ positions. So in what I'm afraid you've all heard about, the Great Replacement theory, it's been around for a while. The assassinations and terrorist acts in Christchurch, New Zealand, and in Halle and Hanau in the last few years were made on the basis of a belief, a conspiracy theory. I don't know if Michael talked about this 2 days ago, that the European code word white people, race, is being eluded by Muslims and is being assisted in this elision and erasure. We will not be erased. Replacement theories often carry the sign by feminists who are refusing to have children, and rich Jews like George Soros who finance their nefarious efforts. Not in my name, this woman. So I'm showing you some propagandistic pages. They're not, I could show you, unfortunately, 100 images like this. This is from, again, the Alternative für Deutschland, Alternative for Germany, a few years ago from a Facebook page, and it's saying, masculinity and femininity is not a social construct. Note the binary way in which masculinity and femininity is being framed. And again, we have the blonde woman of childbearing age. We are protecting her from gender. We are protecting her and her right to have children. With Laura Borchert, who I mentioned earlier, doing queer critique of law. We have studied anti-trans legislation in Germany and the United States, and we looked at the tropes and narratives behind it. In one of a series of acts, this is the conservative movement's biggest boogaboo right now, trans rights, and it's, I could say a lot about this, but it's a very effective cultural warfare deployment of fears people have. Mississippi, the Miss Fairness Act, Miss Unmarried Woman in English, which went into place in 2021, has spearheaded many laws that make it illegal for youth to get gender affirming treatment, or for trans youth to participate in sports teams or to use locker rooms, gender appropriate locker rooms. This law, and this is where I'm seeing that an image of the cis woman or girl is being deployed actually in an anti-feminist and anti-trans way. So this act, the Miss Act, presumes the vulnerability and defenselessness of young girls who have to be protected in locker rooms and in sport teams. In Governor Reeves' words, this important piece of legislation will ensure that young girls in Mississippi have a fair, level playing field. It sends a clear message to my daughters and all of Mississippi's daughters that their rights are worth fighting for. Effectively persuasive to some, Reeves conveys a narrative about individual and imperiled girls, personalized as Mississippi's and his own daughters. Old school images of trans persons as men dangerously masquerading as women are made manifest here. All trans people are really men in a dress who are only adopting that dress in order to do gendered violence to cis women and girls. What Laura and I saw that were two tropes being deployed in this German and American anti-trans legislation, and I'm not bringing up the German laws or the German because that would go too far here. First, non-binary and trans persons are treated as childlike. They're not full legal persons. They are too immature to know about their gender identities. Hence, they have to be protected, paternalized from above. They may not make those decisions. Or, as in the Mississippi bill I just quoted, trans and non-binary persons are posed as threatening to do gendered sexualized violence to cis children and women. In both cases, the cis girl or woman is being deployed. Again, not in my feminist name. Regretfully, I could show you a lot of examples like this. The image on the left became popular in Germany after what we call the Kölner Nacht 2015 and 2016, in which a number of women were attacked at the Cologne train station watching fireworks, which are very big in Germany on New Year's Eve. This sign, I've done semiotic analysis on it, so I'm going to give you a very quick version. It is a reversal of a logo that you all know. It's all over every bathroom of the university where I work as a sign of we are good people, refugees welcome. And it features a family of three, a very traditional family, father, mother, child with pigtails, girl child with pigtails behind them. Comes from America, was originally the sign, a warning sign on a highway in California. Be careful for families crossing the border and running across the highway. It's reversed here. The little girl with pigtails has become an adult woman, a young adult woman, we can see with her figure, her flowing hair, who is being chased by three men who are visually described as Muslim. One is wearing a kaftan or a throbe, a headdress, and are carrying what looks like a knife and two bombs. In other words, sexually dangerous predators, Islamic and criminal. And here, regretfully, you can see it in a protest in Germany, this sign. This has been called by Gabriele Dietze and Eva Jogese ethnosexualization, a form of racism that is deployed onto an ethnic group, particularly onto Muslim men. And Sarah Ferris is called feminationalism, when feminist tropes are used for conservative, nationalistic, ultimately racist, Islamophobic purposes. Not in my name. So where do we go from here? This overdetermination of woman, this overdetermination of feminisms. I don't want to end on a miserable note. How do, and I am channeling Rosie Braidotti's wonderful dialogue with Judith Butler from the beginning of the 90s, in which they agree on there are many ways to escape the kingdom of the phallus. How do we escape the kingdom of patriarchal femininity? There have been many efforts, and this is to show the strong similarity between trans manifesto, trans feminisms now, and lesbian separatist feminisms of the 1970s. In the 1970s, there was an effort to escape the overdetermination of woman as the other of man by retitling her womyn or as lesbian. As Audre Lorde described herself, she is a Black lesbian feminist, mother, warrior, poet, all of which were contested at the time. Foundational texts include Lorde's uses of the erotic, quoted in the wonderful talk by Julia just before the break, Monique Wittig's The Straight Mind, Adrienne Rich's Compulsory Heterosexuality, Cheryl Clark's Lesbianism, an Act of Resistance, or Lord's often quoted statement, and this is the radicality of lesbianism: the true feminist deals out of a lesbian consciousness, whether or not she ever sleeps with women. I believe particularly in the collocation of lesbians as TERFs, that the radicality of these lesbian manifestos and position papers and their historical importance for queer and trans manifestos has been erased or is being erased. Braidotti picking up on a rigore, but also channeling Haraway's "I'd rather be a cyborg than a woman, woman not in my name," describes a becoming woman as a way forward. Many of you will know this. In other words, the subject of feminism is not woman as the complementary and specular other of man, but rather a complex and multi-layered embodied subject who has taken her distance from the institution of femininity. She no longer coincides with the disempowered reflection of a dominant subject who casts his masculinity in a universalistic posture. She, in fact, may no longer be a she, but the subject of a quite another story, a subject in process, a mutant, the other of the other, a post-woman, embodied subject cast in female morphology, who has already undergone an essential metamorphosis. Parallel to the woman to women of the 1970s is a move to reconsider, to escape the phallocentric femininity by trying to rethink, reinscribe, rearrange creatively woman as Womxn. This term, it's an analog to Latinx to describe neither Latinos or Latinas, but Latinx people, those who are trans or non-binary, started being used around 2016. Ebony Miranda's called a Womxn, a woman and those affected by misogyny or woman-related issues. To say that the TERF position is not a majority one amongst lesbians and queer women would be to say that the majority of queer women websites now specifically include trans and feminine identifying women. I'm quoting the queer website Her for Womxn. When they changed the site in 2018, they wrote, Her has been using the more inclusive Womxn, which includes trans women and feminine identifying non-binary people, as well as cisgender women. Can decolonial queer trans feminisms be a way forward out of the inscription of feminisms as racist, bourgeois, and exclusionist? As feminist separatists called themselves women rather than women as the other of men, this effort to redefine gender runs parallel to trans and non-binary persons' call for gender self-determination. The move for feminisms to embrace trans and non-binary positions is apparent in Verona, Italy, working through the work of Carla Casata as a reaction to the transphobia, nationalism, and anti-gender sentiments expressed at the 13th World Congress of Families in March 2019. The feminist movement Non Una di Meno declared that Verona Città Transfemminista, Verona is a trans feminist city, and mobilized 100,000 people to march against transphobia, countering the claim that was being made that trans people, again, deployment of the helpless girl, hurt natural cis women. This group insisted that all feminist action is inherently trans, or it can be nothing at all. This echoes Emi Kasama's, this is one of several trans feminist manifestos that insists that we have the sole right to make decisions regarding our own bodies, and that no political, medical, or religious authority shall violate the integrity of our bodies against our own will or impede our decisions. Trans feminism believes in fostering an environment where women's individual choices are honored while scrutinizing and challenging institutions. The manifesto bespeaks the common ground between trans activism and feminisms: control over the body, control over self-determination. So where am I now? Can decolonial queer trans feminisms, there is no one feminism besides of joy. Can we escape our overdetermination as Womxn and as feminists? How do we resist the catfight trope, which is used to hurt trans people and feminists alike? I see, and this is problematic, the continued hypervisibility of some Womxn, particularly if they are young, thin, white, considered desirable and commodifiable, and the invisibility virtually of all other feminized persons. These are conjoined aspects of femophobia. During the pandemic, I was asked to speak several times to feminist and queer communities, and I talked about, because you had those dominant and very real narratives, you were reading them, hopefully not death scrolling them all the time, of setbacks for queer communities, setbacks for women that were caused by Corona. I could do this with a simplistic, anecdotal way. Middle-aged white male academic said, I got so much done during Corona, I wrote 3 books. Very different positioning from many others due to embodiment, due to their material circumstances. So how did we move from internalizing those really true messages about falling behind and not just make them close us down? For me, this is queering, transing, and woman-exing, woman and feminism. I turned to something that was again spoken to by Julia's wonderful talk and her mentioning the uses of the erotic by Audre Lorde. And it's about a non-inscribed form of being. And I turned to Kay Tempest as a form of also comforting myself and others. It could be that connection to another deeper world is most easily experienced by artists, but really anyone who's ever meditated, prayed, studied the stars, cooked an important meal for people they love, thrown a punch, received one, built something with their hands, learned a skill because they had no choice, been in service to others, volunteered their time, found themselves at the edge of their sanity or the edge of experience, accepted a difficult truth, put themselves second, genuinely gone out of their way for somebody else, has felt it. Connection is not the sole domain of artists, but art is a good way of understanding the fruit of that other place where commonality begins. We are meditating here a mimesis. We have a model, the post-literary mimetic turn. We have a different, entirely different history. Gadamer through recurrent, Rita Felsky. I think Caviero might also belong to this, of mimesis as creative re-arrangement through metaphor. And we have Arrigare, Wittig, and Braidotti also describing a mimetic, because we're trying to avoid ideology. It's the question, do I take off my glasses and see the ideology which is all around me, that is all I can see? How do I step outside of it? I cannot. I am deeply aware of my inscription as a woman and a feminist, of the impossibility of moving outside of that inscription, and yet as an embodied trans, queer, decolonial, feministic woman, Womxn, I continue to try and to resist. Thank you.